Hello, this is Rick Jordan with the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship of North Carolina. Welcome to today's webinar. Today's webinar is on Where's Church Going From Here? And our presenter is Eddie Hammett. Eddie has served on church staff and denominational leadership for over 29 years. He has been the Church and Clergy Coach for the CBF of North Carolina since 2009. Eddie is the author of over 500 published articles and 8 books, including Spiritual Leadership in a Secular Age. He is the president of Transforming Solutions and is a master certified coach with the International Coach Federation. Eddie lives in Hendersonville, North Carolina. Today's webinar will begin with Eddie's presentation. If you have questions to ask or comments you'd like to make, you can put them in the question box. It's at the bottom of your screen. You can scroll down. It says Q&A. Click on that and enter the question. We'll take them at the end, but you can enter them at any time. Thank you for participating in today's webinar. And just a reminder that this will be recorded and will be put in our resource library for CBF North Carolina, so you can see it again at another time if you'd like. Eddie, we welcome you. And before you begin your formal presentation, tell us how you became interested in this subject.
Thanks, Rick. It's good to be with you again. And I'm delighted to talk about the subject because it really has been bubbling in me since I wrote the Spiritual Leadership in a Secular Age book about 10 years ago. I have been in church life all of my life and other arenas through the coaching world. But what I came to realize is that many of our churches across the country, across all denominational lines, many of them are declining. And yet, there's a lot of interest in spirituality in our culture. And so I started exploring in my own community and in my own family systems and friends, looking at the whole issue of spirituality beyond the church. And I'm concluding pretty quickly that spirituality has some deep roots in a lot of people, and yet they're not going to our traditional churches to find the answers. So I'm on a pilgrimage to try to begin to figure out how do we help spiritual formation happen as church, but yet beyond institutional means. I still believe in the institutional church, still go to an institutional church, but there are a lot of people who aren't going to do that anymore for whatever reason. So I'm on a pilgrimage, and I'm going to share part of that pilgrimage with you today.
Thank you. Thank you. We look forward to hearing from you. You take off from here then.
All right, my friends. As I say, what I'm trying to do here is to begin a conversation through the webinar. I'm going to do 2 other events, one a 3-hour seminar on September 21 in Charlotte, North Carolina, to try to go a little deeper. And then for those who want to bring their leadership team and try to work on it pragmatically, I'm doing a retreat, a 1-day retreat in August the 13th. And if you have any of that, you can email me at my email or go to the cbfnorthcarolina.org website. But I am increasingly convinced that scripture and historical tradition of our institutional church really has 3 basic foundations. We talk about in church through the attractional model, trying to get people to come to the building. And then we have through the church, through the programs of the church, through people, through families, where we have a missional impact of working through the existing programs. But now I think as the new century started, the church institution as we know it is being challenged by a lot of what we call nones and dones, those who are non-affiliated with church or those who are done with church. And yet they are looking for us to show up in the world as church through what I call an incarnational model. And we'll talk a lot about that in these other workshops, but right now we're just going to introduce it to you. When you look at this, what do you see? There are 2 different views of church depicted here, and I love this. One is the church building. You see the cross on the top, and God is crunched in the building. The walls are kind of confining to God. The second view on the right-hand side has church building in the center of God. And that's really kind of what I'm talking about here. We're going beyond the institutional church, not to negate it, not to give up on it, but to say the reality is God's a much bigger God than an institutional church. And we're trying to figure out what that looks like. So to kind of put it in perspective, I've put this, and it's a generalization for sure, but we're moving from an institutional focus to a more God focus. We're moving from building-centered church to a community or a parish-centered church, from a staff-led or an elder-led or denominational-led church to a spirit-led church through the people of passion who are passionate about the mission of God in the world. And then we're moving from church-based membership to membership based in the parish or community. Used to the big hot button issue for churches was worship styles. Now it seems to be membership policies and practices. We move from answers, giving answers and telling, to exploring questions together. And last, but certainly not least, we gather for fellowship and equipping, and we're moving to gathering in the midst of community for fellowship, celebrate, equipping. So it's kind of a both and, but I see a shift happening. And I'm trying to learn to pay attention to that shift. I saw this this van designed as an ice cream truck, took a picture of it. Union Baptist Church has created a GO structure, and they take this ice cream truck through the community, and it attracts children, of course. It attracts and gives a great way to begin conversations and relationships with people. Seems to me that's part of what we're talking about in this particular webinar. These are some other tools that I have found to be very useful. Of course, the book that I did, but Mark Buchanan did a book, Your Church is Too Safe. Really fascinating. And then Tim Shapiro wrote a book called Divergent Church, very stretching, the bright promise of an alternative faith community. So if you want something to stretch you, you might look for that. And then Jim Moss, a Presbyterian friend, has a blog called Wineskins that I have found to be very useful and challenging here. So as we go through, you might frame some questions, those questions, and I can respond, and then we'll continue on. One of the schools that I like to go to, or conferences periodically, is called Inhabit. The one that I found very intriguing and very stimulating for me was last year, Inhabit 2018, at the Seattle School in Seattle, Washington, where we started talking about the new parish. And there are all kind of options to this, but the new parish really takes the community seriously. And that's what I think we need to do, not the church community necessarily, but the geographical community in which we live, in which we work, which we play, and which our church building resides. These are some questions I want to pose to you and really ask that you stop and give some serious reflection. The first question is, based on your personal church experience now, where do you see your church going, say in the next 2 years, the next 5 years, the next 10 years? Many of the churches that I have gone in and out of the last 15, 20 years, many of those, well, some of those, no, I won't say many, but some of those have already closed their doors. They have aged out, their congregation was old, or they could no longer pay the bills, and they've merged with other congregations. And all of that's happened in a very short period of time. How will it differ from how church happens today? If those people no longer decide to meet in the building or no longer can afford to pay the mortgage on the building, how is church going to happen at that time when it moves beyond the building? What type of leaders are going to be needed? What are the characteristics of those leaders? What kind of skills do those leaders need? And I'm pretty convinced in my own heart and mind and experience that the type of leaders needed for the future church aren't going to get their training in most of our seminaries. They're not going to get their training in most of our Sunday school classes. They're going to get their training by becoming an entrepreneur in ministry, the creative thinkers, the people who like to move outside and beyond the box, if you will. And then what type of facilities will be needed? I met with a Presbyterian church last week, I guess it was, and that church is going to get rid of their building. They are downsizing, you might say, their facilities because they no longer need them for the number of people they have. And their ministry focus is really shifting. So they've bought a strip mall and going to refurbish it. And that's where they're going to put in the meeting place, if you will, for their new congregation. And then the last and important question for all churches, whatever expression, how is that church going to be sustained and funded in the future? Another thing I'm very convinced about is the church is no longer going to just be funded by tithes and offerings. There are going to be multiple streams of income if that church is going to be sustained and stable in the future. I was writing some not long ago, and this statement came to surface: reframing church and parish are central in moving the church from floundering to flourishing in the next decade. And I really believe that's true. I think most churches, if they don't start a reframing, rethinking process in terms of the core values, not the biblical core values, but their core values that draws them together as the people of God in a given place, if they don't start reframing and thinking beyond that, I suspect they're going to be floundering more and flourishing less. But if they reframe themselves and get into a prayer focus, get into a reflection focus, begin to ask, what is God doing and how can we join him there? Those kind of churches are going to take on a very different appearance, it seems to me. The last thing I want to share with you here before we pause for a moment about questions. People always say, well, where are the biblical concepts of this stuff you're talking about? We've never heard this before, or we're not too sure about it. These are broad strokes of the biblical concepts that I have in my own heart and mind. Of course, the missional movement in CBFNC life and national CBF life has become a big thing. But my contention is a lot of people still don't really get mission. They think it's just mission activities. We're going to go on a mission trip somewhere, but missional is much more of a movement. Diakonia is what we use to translate into deacons. And yet that servant and the waiter of tables is the framework of what I think a good leader is going to be. The priesthood of all believers is the core foundation of Baptist historically. And notice I've capitalized all. It's not just about the clergy. It's about all of us who are believers and who are learning as we go to represent God in the world in which we now find ourselves. And the other concept that I really have a lot to say about and won't cover it here, but it's really captured my heart and life as I have started a walking group in my own community, and we go walking together, and I've just learned to show up with them as we walk and exercise together. We get into some pretty significant conversations because some are nuns, some are church people who are still involved, and we just have a great conversation as we go. Well, that's an example in my heart and life of incarnational engagement. I'm showing up in that group of people that I ordinarily may not be with in an intentional way. The other is what's called ecclesia in Scripture, that gathered community where we traditionally have worshiped and equipped and had fellowship with each other. There's another community that's noted in Acts chapter 2, the diaspora, the dispersed community. And it seems to me that's where we play, that's where we fellowship in the community, that's where we go and enjoy hobbies together. It's our workplace, that dispersed community where all of us scatter throughout the week. And we are learning to become salt, light, and leaven in the world, meaning we want to have more impact. We want to add greater flavor, if you will, or seasoning by our presence and our purpose. And then the real root of incarnational engagement is dwelling among us. Jesus came and dwelt among us. That is, he moved in. So in the community in which I live, I'm purposefully moved in this community because I wanted to figure out how to be more relational to unchurched people, to the nuns and the duns. I purposefully go out and try to build those relationships. And that's not an easy thing for me because I'm an introvert by nature, but it's something that I really felt convicted and called to do and have been very grateful for that opportunity. So Rick, I'm going to pause right here and see if there are any questions before we move on.
All right, we don't have anyone any questions yet, Eddie. So
okay, I will move on then. One example of where's church going from here can be defined by what's called a dinner church. You can Google this and find all kind of information about it and some videos about it. And in the workshops that we do, we'll see the video and we'll talk about what the challenges are of this, what the benefits of a dinner church. But basically, the dinner church gets together and has dinner together. I mean, it's not rocket science, but it is an intentional and prayerful way of having meaningful conversations. It's not held in a church building traditionally. It's held in a more casual, open, welcoming environment. And the language that's used typically is not that of church language or theological language. It's regular language, and learning to pay attention to our language is really important. And that's been a real challenge for me for decades now, and something I still work on. You see these pictures of having church beyond the building and the handbook for the dinner church. The handbook you can order off on Amazon or through Fresh Expressions. But you see a picture where one of these experiences, they had Eucharist on the beach. You see the chalice, you see the cross, you see the wine and the bread. And then you see another church on the left-hand side, and after the church building behind them, but they decided they were going to start doing church outside. During the summer months, they moved church outside so that people in the community would feel more comfortable, because a lot of non-church people really are threatened by our buildings. They don't know how to get in. That once they get in, they don't know how to get out. And we who go all the time, we really don't pay attention to that kind of anxiety. So moving outside is another way of moving church beyond the building. Another collaboration that has emerged in Winston-Salem is called the Salt Box. John Bost used to be the mayor in the area in that community in Clemens, and he and another group of people have formed a nonprofit organization called the Salt Box. Now remember, I talked about we needed to be better salt, light, and leaven in the world. Well, John took that seriously with his colleagues, and they formed a nonprofit organization trying to figure out how to form transformational partnerships in the city of Winston-Salem. Yes, it's an expression of church. Yes, when they get together, there's accountability. Yes, they have Bible study. Yes, they have meals that they share together. But it's not in a traditional church building, nor does it function like a traditional church. But it really does have a transformational impact on the spiritual life of the whole community. Another representation of church in the world is done by a guy by the name of Matt Overton. He's part of a Presbyterian church in Ohio, and he has a Facebook page called Youth Ministry Innovators. Matt is probably the greatest, most impactful youth minister I've had any contact with through the years. Matt really is trying to reach the millennial and Generation Z. His youth ministry design is not just activity, it's not just mission trips, it's not just fellowships, it's not just Bible study in the church. You see, Matt has started a nonprofit organization where he invites the younger people to go in and help do yard work for people in the community in which they reside. The church, the truck that you see there, Making Good Things Happen, is one of the first trucks that they got, put their lawnmowers in that truck, went around, and he not only taught the kids the skill of lawn care, but he taught them how to start at their own business, and he got them involved in the business adventures and all the details of setting up a business and what a nonprofit looked like, and was able to articulate their faith to people that they shared their skills with through the lawn care organization. Again, it's just another way of doing church in the world. It's learning to show up and be of value to the people in the community in which you live, who may or may not come to the church on Sunday or Wednesday or whenever. It's touching them at their point of need in a very relevant, very significant way that's greatly appreciated in their community, and it teaches life skills. So I think Matt does a great job with that. Another image that I have been exploring in my own personal ministry and professional ministry as well is what I call forming incubator communities of faith. You see the baby in the incubator. There are a lot of people, I'm convinced, some are nuns, some are duns, some are church people, who are in an incubator trying to figure out how their faith is to be expressed in the world in which they live, or in the family in which they grew up, or in the community in which they reside, or the workplace in which they work every day. I had the privilege of working with about 10 business people 2 or 3 weeks ago in an incubator of community of faith. Some of these were church-related people, some of these were nuns and duns, but all of them were business people. And I was invited in as their coach and the collaborator. And what we did was explore together how faith shows up and what does their faith look like in their workplace or in their school system. And how does it show up there? That's a really important question. However, there was a Buddhist in this group as well as some Christians. There were Methodists and Presbyterians and Baptists. So community, an incubator of community of faith, is not going to just come from one stream of thought, if you will, or one form of worship. One of the things we talked about in this gathering is, so how does worship show up for you in your workplace? How do you reflect on your workplace experiences in a way that fuels your faith, or either destroys your faith? What's happening with you when you leave the workplace, and how do you process all of that? For me, that's an incubator of faith. Spiritual formation language works in church among church people, but you got to find different language if you're going to talk to people in the incubator of faith. They often don't really spend a lot of time reflecting there, or if they do, they come up with a language that's very, very different than what we experience in our traditional church settings. This is another example at Furman University. I'm a graduate of Furman, and there's what's called a Mere Christianity Forum there. It's a house, and they live in community in this house. And it's built around faith, reason, and Christianity principles. And these students live together, and they have meals together, and they share their journey as a college student of how they're beginning to figure out how to be a servant scholar, how to serve in the world or through the career in which they're going. And excuse me, Catherine McKelvin is part of this, and her husband. They've been there doing this for quite a while. And it's just another great example of a way student ministry is done. It's a way of taking Christianity into a different forum beyond the walls of the institutional church, but sharing very much the same kind of faith philosophy, if you will, of trying to be church in the world. You see diversity is coming into our community, it's coming into our families, it's coming into our churches. Not only ethnic diversity and multicultural issues, but they're different ways of expressing faith. And you see the picture there of Rhymes and Catherine McKelvin that's part of the Christianity Forum at Furman. This is their family. They've adopted some children. You see 2 of their children are white, 2 are African American, and they're building that kind of nucleus in their own family system. And I just love the quote there on the left: "We must learn to live together as brothers or perish together as fools." Martin Luther King said that, and I just love that picture and love the image. But the question I want to pause and let you reflect on in your own heart and mind, and then Rick will see if there are any questions about this before we move on. How often do you show up in a diverse world other than the way you think or the way you dress or the way you live? How does your faith take you into places where it may be strange environments for you? It may be stretching environments for you. It may be threatening environments for you. But how do you show up there as the incarnational presence of Christ that moves in your life? That's what I'm trying to get at here. Where's church going from here? It's going a lot of really neat places, and I probably have more hope for the message of God in the world than I've ever had in my 40 years of doing this and coaching. But I really think God's up to something new, and I don't want to miss it by being held and confined in a building that we traditionally call church. So Rick, I'll stop there for a moment and see if there are any questions.
We don't have any questions yet. Let me just remind everyone that you can ask a question by scrolling to your bottom of your screen, and there's a box there with a Q on it, and it says Q&A under that box. If you'll click on that, then you can type in a question, and we'll have it to present to Eddie.
Great. I may be scaring people to death, and they don't want to ask him questions. Well, when you start exploring into this new world, if you will, of church beyond the walls, chaos emerges pretty quickly. It may be internal chaos, it may be external chaos, It may be spiritual chaos. It may be emotional chaos. And I've had to come to the conclusion that that's okay, because chaos of the heart and the mind and the soul comes before clarity. And clarity emerges and it forms commitment. And commitments come before commissioning. And I really think churches need to face this reality that the world we have known and many have grown up in the institutional church, pretty secure place. That's why we call it a sanctuary. Safe, it's secure. Of course, in the day where violence is coming into some of our churches, that's a whole different webinar. But it's not a secure world anymore, and we don't all think the same, and we don't all behave the same, and we don't all believe the same. We don't all dress the same, and that's okay. As long as we're looking for, God, what are you doing here? What's going here? And I think that's part of the incarnational dimension of this. Clarity before commitment. Many of our churches are saying, well, what's happened to the commitment of our people? We just don't have a lot of commitment anymore. People are going hither and yon, and they're never coming to church anymore. Well, I personally believe that a lot of that happens because people don't have the clarity of how to be the people of God in this new world in which we find ourselves. A world that's primarily unchristian or non-Christian, a world that's very diverse in population base and demographics, as well as in ethnicity and multicultural systems. But once we get clarity about how to show up in those environments, I've just seen example after example after example of people going to a deeper level of faith commitment. Once they get a clarity that God really is up to something. It may be something new, but he's up to something. And now for us to search it out, seek it out, rather than stay within our comfortable sanctuaries. And then commitment before commissioning is another piece. That commissioning, I believe, needs to happen to all the people of God, all the priesthood of believers. Commissioning public school teachers as they go back to school in the fall, or commissioning people who are going on youth trips. We do that pretty consistently. But what about commissioning people who own their own business, who are the manager of a team of people in the business world, or people who are in the hospital system, who are taking healing into the hospitals? That can be part of the commissioning service that the gathered church can be a part of, but we don't often take advantage of that. And consequently, I think we miss a great opportunity of introducing and implementing meaningful change. Rick, did I see a question pop up?
Yes, we've got several questions now. One question is that reads, our current church body comes from a number of neighborhoods and communities. It makes parish-style community difficult. Should we be calling them into ministering to our surrounding community or sending them out to minister to the community that they live in?
Yeah, a good question. And it's the community they live in. Mm-hmm. They become the priest in that community, which means we have to equip them to do that, which is a whole different can of worms. And we'll talk about that a lot more in the retreat setting. But yeah, the community in which they live and work is their mission field.
So I want to follow up on that question with this, that, a church is in a community, say, right. The church building is.
Right.
So should they minister? I mean, how should they also minister to that community? Or do they just say, where you are in your work, play, school, that's where you're ministering, and this just happens to be the gathering spot?
Yeah, I think that goes back to whatever the core vision of that particular church is. If they're only committed to their geographical community, then they have to go there. My personal take on it is that I think we need to be the scattered community and then gather back at the church house, if you will,
Mhm.
once a week, once a quarter, whatever you decide you want to do. But I think that decision has to come from the individual church's mission statement.
Another question is, you mentioned multiple streams of income.
Yeah.
And the question is, what are tax implications of income coming from sources beyond tithes and offerings?
Yeah, that's a great question and an important question, and it really depends on the state that you're in. But you can set up nonprofit organizations that are attached to your church. We really can't with that in this, the next 10 minutes here, but a lot of churches are doing nonprofit organizations now that are streams of income for them, and they work it out with the tax attorneys in their particular community and state.
Hmm.
It's a critical question.
And then we have another one about worship style. The contemporary style of worship seen in mega churches and smaller churches has become widespread and popular. Does liturgy still have a place in worship in the new modes of church that you're mentioning?
Absolutely. And again, it depends on how you choose to express your church and where you choose to express. But like with these businessmen and women that I was with the other week, we did a liturgy that was part of that, and a litany that we read out together as part of a commissioning when we left that experience. So it really depends, but you have to get creative, and you usually have to write your own, because a lot of this is not in print, so that we can open up a book and do it. And that's why a lot of people don't do it. But I think God's calling us to a deeper faith and a deeper commitment and a deeper sense of innovation and creativity as we figure out how to do this.
Great. Those are the questions we have this far.
Okay, great. Good questions. Another expression of this, and another good resource, Making Neighborhoods Whole, a handbook for Christian community development. And Wayne Gordons and John Perkins address this tax question that you're raising, so you might want to look at that. But they also talk about the multicultural environment that most of us find ourselves in now, in even a geographical community. The community in which I live is full of all kind of ethnic groups, different age groups, churched, unchurched, dechurched, people who are excited about their faith, people who are skeptical of their faith. And we have a community building that's part of our community. And I've just made it my purpose of how do I relate to all of this diversity. And this book has been really, really helpful for me in that. And you see the sign there, love thy neighbor with no exceptions. Now, that's a real challenge, whether it's a political challenge or whether it's an ethnicity challenge or a cultural challenge or a race challenge. But I think the people of God in the world in which we live, we really are responsible for figuring out how do we love thy neighbor with no exceptions. And it's not about judging our neighbor, it's about showing up with our neighbor. It's about getting to know each other in the neighborhood, get to know their story without judgment. They get to know our story with exploring these life questions that are very complicated these days, exploring those together, whether it's over an ice cream cone or a cup of coffee, or whether you're taking a walk in the community together. All of those are where church happens, and community emerges as church begins to happen, as we get to know each other better, as we get to share stories with each other better, without judgment. and without ridicule. Another expression of church, I found this sign I took a picture of, St. Elias Orthodox Church. And you see all of these nonprofit organizations that are housed in that church building. Church is now becoming an umbrella for multi-human service for the community. There are multiple nonprofit organizations that are here. St. John's in Charlotte, North Carolina, is involved in this right now, trying to figure out how to effectively use their building to help house nonprofit organizations and people that can serve the community in which they are located, but also in the parish in which all of them live, scattered across the city. So when I saw this sign, I thought, wow, that's a great illustration of church being the church in the world. And where is the church going from here? I think it's going far beyond just a building for a gathered service on Sunday and Wednesday or whenever you gather for worship. I think it's becoming a housing unit for a multiplicity of services. And that changes your leadership base, it changes your financial base, it changes your notoriety in the community, how you're known in that particular community. So suffice it to say that where church is going from here is far beyond traditional programming that we have known for the last 30, 40 years. I mentioned my neighborhood. My neighborhood is my incubator of relationships. You see an African-American young guy there who works in our community. You see another picture where somebody's walking out of a church building that represents some other people in my community who've decided they're done with church. They don't want to go there. They've been there, done that, they say, and they're burned out. They didn't find any meaning in it. But now many of them are walking in faith to faith-based nonprofit organizations in the community. And that's where we have some great conversations. And you see walking friends with Duns. I do that in our local mall. If it's raining outside and I'm walking, I go to the mall and walk. Well, we have a group there that walks together. And many of the folks here are Duns. I mean, and it's sad on one sense, but on the other sense, I see it as a real challenge and an opportunity to get to know other people's story. They're curious about my story, and we learn together. And it's really been an invigorating piece of my faith walk for the last eight or 10 years. You were told I'm a master certified coach and have been doing that for about 15 years now. And I spend a lot of my coaching time now with entrepreneurs in the business world. And I've spent a lot of time coaching pastors and denominational people, and I still do some of that as a professional coach. But I really have found it a great excitement, refreshment, if you will, of coaching these business entrepreneurs. And I am a heart patient. That's why I do all this walking. But I'm also coaching heart patients. I had a coach when I was a heart patient and had open heart surgery. It was amazing to me, the impact that coach had on my recovery. And I never got depressed as a heart patient and was told I probably would. And I think that coach was responsible for that. And then the business entrepreneurs, you can't start a new business and not have the purpose of life questions come forward. Home, are dealing with finances, are dealing with your value system and having your value system challenged. So I see the coaching in my way of thinking, coaching is the new Sunday school teacher for people, particularly outside and beyond the institutional church. They're asking and struggling with a lot of the faith questions, a lot of the value questions. And as a professional Christian coach, I have the opportunity of dealing with them in a confidential relationship and one-on-one experiences. Is proving to be far more transformational than most of the Sunday school classes I taught or was part of through the years. So, in fact, next week I'll be doing a training session with coaches to train new coaches again, because I believe it's a catalyst, and CBF North Carolina is part of that system and believes that coaching has a real value in the world in which we now live, but also in the world that is emerging. Another thing here that I want to focus on, and then we're going to finish up here and see if there are any questions. Most of our churches have talked about being called out of the pew to serve in professional ministry, or called out to serve as a deacon, or called out to serve as a Sunday school teacher. I'm talking about being called to and called up to something so we can show up in the world and focus on what matters to us in a day-to-day life rather than just on Sunday morning. So, Rick, that's what I have here. Any questions that we need to deal with? Our time's about up.
There are not any questions. Let's give a second just to see if anybody wants to send us a question.
Okay.
All right. We do have a question about what does biblical education look like in these new models? I want to do more than create another program for people to come to.
Well, I anticipated that question just by the next slide.
Uh-huh.
That always comes up, and it's a valid question. But we got to stretch beyond the traditional Sunday school class. It works for church-focused people and people who have a faith in Scripture. But people like Randy, you see Randy there with his dog. I've been discipling Randy for years, and we do that online. He lives in Boston, Massachusetts, and we get together in a group called Spiritual Travelers, and we have retreats, and those retreats are Bible studies and reflective Bible studies. It's like theological reflection. You see the Starbucks, a lot of coffee shops have a lot of Bible study going on in them. I was in one the other day, Starbucks here in town, and a Bible study was going on around the coffee cup. So yes, it happens, but it happens at the teachable moment. So you have to be ready. You have to show up. You have to be willing to spend time. But yeah, it's very transformational, and it does happen, but not in what we would call a traditional Sunday school class.
Mm-hmm. So then there's a question, how do we best train others in the church to be doing this?
Well, that's why I train coaches, because I think that's one of the best ways of doing it. And that's why I'm writing this book about where's church going from here, and why we're going to do the seminar and the workshop. I've been experimenting with it for 15, 16 years. And gathering resources, and I'm going to try to share those through CBF North Carolina and through webinars and writings and whatever. But yeah, it's a different way of thinking, and it's a different way of training people. You're absolutely right.
Mm-hmm. And the person also commented they want to make sure it's more than just pastors who are doing this work.
Absolutely. I mean, it should not be just pastors. It should be all the priesthood of all believers.
Mm-hmm.
Lay people have more value in this than pastors anyway.
Mm. Is that because they're already out there?
That's right. We need to equip the saints for the work of ministry, like Paul says in Ephesians.
Mm-hmm.
And the work of ministry is in the world. It's not in the church.
Mm-hmm. Those are the questions we have right now.
All right. Well, I appreciate you joining us in the webinar. And if you want to participate in the Charlotte experience or the others, that would be great as well. Just let me know. My email is edwardhammett@gmail.com. Thank you and have a good day.
Thank you so much, Eddie. I appreciate your sharing and your heart for this ministry that has been, you've had it for a long time and have been consistent, giving us a consistent message. So I appreciate that. And thank you for sharing with us today.
Thank you.